Britain is a white supremacist nation, and let's talk about it. So yes, I talk about books here, so this video will be regarding books. I'm not going to necessarily be having books about the statistics behind white supremacy in Britain, just because I don't have those specific books having been read, other than, you know, articles and papers, but I don't talk about that here. So I will give you some books about history of Britain, much of the white supremacy in Britain, and also, you know, other forms of racism in Britain. And with that, I recommend you to read them. I'm also going to be putting a link to the GoFundMe for Jason Arday, who I would say his killing is the reason behind this video being made. So, you know, if you want to donate to that, you should do that. Instead of me giving my shout out for becoming a member, I would rather you give money to that GoFundMe. But yeah, it's going to be a heavy video. Let's get into it. Firstly, I want to talk about a book I'm currently reading, which is Empireland by Sathnam Sanghera. This book is tracing not just the British Empire, but many empires across the world and their impact on the world and the reasons behind some of it. I'm about more than 3/4 of the way through this book, probably 4/5 of the way through the book. I will probably do a whole video on it next week, but this book, there is quite a bit of focus on Britain, because obviously Sathnam Sanghera, Indian, British Indian, there is that link there. It's just like me, I know the most about colonialism of India just because of my personal relationship with it. This book goes into great detail, not just showing you, you know, the machinations that led to colonialism and the effects of it, but sort of some of the thought process and the race science behind a lot of the colonialism from Britain. For example, it talks heavily so far about how the British viewed Africans, how the British viewed Native Americans, Indians, Chinese, how they tried to use deliberate tactics to justify their colonialism, tried to use race science to justify their colonialism, something that people like Nathan Confass would call race realism nowadays. Now, I'm not calling him a racist. I'm not calling him that. However, many of his views, I would say, to a degree, align with the views of the British during colonialism. Now, a lot of these views of particularly Africans or Caribbean people have been trickled down to modern day Britain. A lot of these ideas that, you know, certain groups are lazy, or certain groups are inherently violent, or certain groups have more of a predisposition to you know, bad behavior. This is all a relic of colonialism, and that's not even getting into some of the, I think it's called epigenetic effects of colonialism, in particular slavery, on people particularly in the Caribbean or modern day United States or South America, or even people who suffered indentured servitude as well. So the British Empire is one of the roots of white supremacy, maybe one of the bigger roots of white supremacy. This idea that white people are, you know, more human, better than non-white people, stems from the British, one, trying to justify their enslavement or pillaging of peoples across the world, you know, the white man's burden, as Rudyard Kipling calls it, and also stems from the justification they had to give for brutalizing groups, because even, you know, during British colonialism, there were Brits, there were white Brits, just like now, who were compassionate, who were like, hey, maybe we shouldn't mistreat these human beings. And so the empire, just like now, the racists or the white supremacists, the far right, have to come up with these justifications. So obviously this is not a one-to-one comparison, but it does really show you how this legacy of white supremacy and colonialism is still one of the big driving forces behind why the British media went out of its way to harass a black man because, you know, it's easy pickings for them, because there is this ingrained attitude across Britain that, you know, you can attack black people. I mean, Meghan Markle is moving back to the UK next month as of recording this video. You know, the British press is going to go out of their way to attack her, and, you know, she's married to a guy who is part of, you know, a descendant of the colonial family, the royal colonial family. Next up, I want to talk about The Islamophobia Industry by Lean. This book I'm talking about, not particularly because of Islamophobia, but because within this book and other similar books, the two things are related. Racism and Islamophobia are both rooted in very similar places. You know, they maybe with Islamophobia there is that more Christian nationalist lean to it, but overall it is rooted in bigotry and also rooted in creating a scapegoat, creating a target for generally the working class to be distracted by and attack, as opposed to attacking the ruling classes who are responsible for almost everything that is wrong with much of the working class's lives. So I know this from personal experience, and yes, our anecdotal experience isn't something you should really be using as evidence, so this isn't going to be evidence, this is just me giving an anecdote. I got a fresh TikTok channel because my old one got banned for talking about Palestine. However, I made some videos about what's happened to Jason Arday and about the white supremacy in Britain, and the entire comment section for all of those videos I just flooded with people being like, actually, yeah, it is his fault, or leaning into the negative stereotypes about black people spread by the same people that Lean refers to in the Islamophobia industry. All of this, and this is being commented by everyday normal people. They are siding with the bourgeois class, as opposed to, you know, a black man who was driven to killing himself by the bourgeois class. You know, it is, you know, I am a firm believer in intersectionality. There are some left-wing people who believe you need to be class reductionist, that class alone will be something you have to look at to solve everything. I just don't believe that is the case, simply because class has been so intertwined with race because of the actions of the bourgeois class. Maybe if we went back to before colonialism, and where white supremacy and racism became really ingrained into Western culture, and, you know, that never happened, no slavery, nothing like that, and stuff proceeded as they were, maybe there would be more of a case for this class reductionist idea where race isn't intertwined with it. But even then, you know, misogyny, which is something we'll actually get into in our next video, in our next book, so all these sort of things are intertwined. And so the Islamophobia industry, obviously focusing on, you know, Islamophobia in this instance. However, the exact same ideas and processes that Lean refers to, you know, the money coming from, a lot of it coming from the far right, the internet being a big place for it to be spread rapidly and more efficiently. But even, you know, going back to Sathnam Sanghera's book Empireworld, even then he speaks about how colonial newspapers were able to send newspapers relatively cheaply back to Britain and vice versa, where they would be spreading this, you know, racist ideology back and forth, which is basically what people do now, but they use Twitter instead. So, and again, you know, the attacks on Jason Arday were spurred on not just by the British mainstream media, which it certainly was spurred on by, but spurred on by these, you know, far-right individuals, these far-right activists. Again, someone like Nathan Confas, who, again, I will not say if he is actually a racist. I will say allegedly Nathan Confas is a white supremacist. Allegedly. So these sort of individuals were key in driving this home. Even since Jason Arday was killed by the British media and far right, these same agitators are going online and spreading the same hate. And like I said, there are people who are very clearly proletariat in my comment sections on TikTok talking about how they are, not just talking about how, literally spreading the exact same stuff that the bourgeois class is spreading about Jason Arday, because what is more effective than, attacking a black autistic man? What is more effective than that in the West? The West, the bourgeois class are jumping at the opportunity to distract away from the cost of living crisis, the inability to get a job, by directing it at a black man. And also that idea that, running with, oh, see, he only was successful because he's black. All of these non-white people are only successful because they're not white. Playing into this new framework the white supremacists have, which is, yes, we are supreme, but also we're being oppressed by the non-white individuals. And that's the same thing with the Islamophobia industry. This whole idea that Muslims are given special privileges in Britain, and this idea of that is being spread by the far right to engender Islamophobia within the proletariat. And finally, I'll go into detail about one more book, but there are other books I will mention afterwards. But I want to talk about White Tears, Brown Scars by Ruby Hamad. I think this is a book I've read multiple videos about. I have, proselytized this book, I think, for a long time. It was one of my biggest videos as well. But White Tears, Brown Scars is basically talking about how white feminism is oftentimes done at the expense of black and brown women, but also black and brown men as well. That is indicated in this book too. So much of, and look, also, I can go back to Empireworld and talk about it there too, and also the Islamophobia industry. Much of the racism against particularly, black men and now more so brown men is this idea that they are trying to protect, in particularly white women, from these savage beasts that are non-white men. It is, there are other things I could probably go into about it, including sexuality and stuff, but I'm not going to go, I don't have a specific reference for that other than what's in this book to go off of. But there are resources out there. I think FD Signifier also is putting out like a whole documentary where I have a feeling this is something that is going to be addressed significantly in that. So, when that comes out, I recommend you watch it. But, for example, many of the depictions of, we'll say particularly black men here, many of the depictions of black men in particular in pornography is because of the fear, not even the fears, the white supremacist attitude that is pervasive in places like Britain. You hear that age-old story of people, of black men, about their appendages, about apparently being aggressive. This was all done because of white supremacy as a reason to relate black men in particular to animals and beasts, to make them, more bestial in particular. But also, it's done to young black boys and girls. They are adultified. They aren't treated as children, as innocent. It's the reason why the Met Police loves illegally strip searching little black boys and black girls. It is abhorrent, and there's this adultification which is related to this animalization of black people, in this case in particularly black men. And also, building on top of that, white supremacy will describe black people as animals as well, to try and make them seem less intelligent, which is one of the reasons why so many white people are coming out of the woodwork being like, of course, Jason Arday must be a plagiarist, must not be that intellectual because he's a black man, because they believe that black people aren't capable of being as intellectual as white people. Nathan Confast in particular doesn't think black people have the means to be able to be intellectuals. So all of these things are related, and so this branch of white feminism, which excludes in particular people, women of colour, all peoples of colour, and also that these white tears, this white feminism, this defence of white women has always been done at the expense of black men and women, in this case Jason Arday. You know, we also see that there are many other academics who have faced charges of, or accusations of plagiarism. Most of them, all the ones we're talking about here, white men, white women in particular, and they haven't been hounded as harshly as Jason Arday was. Why? Because he is a black man. You know, the attacks or attacking black men to protect the sanctity of white men and white women needs to be done by the British media, the British press, and even the US press. I was seeing the US press talking about this story. You know, obviously Ruby Hamad's book does lean more into the relationship between white women and women of colour, you know, particularly like thinking about the suffragettes. Non-white women weren't allowed in the suffragettes until much later and after much haranguing by women of colour, building on this idea that, you know, black men are bestial, black men are dangerous. It's the reason why there also, I think I made reference to it earlier, there's a lot of pornography, particularly surrounding black men, because it is this, it's a strange fantasy that white supremacists have. It's almost like this, I can't think of an intellectual word other than like cuckoldery of these white supremacists, where they kind of imagine seeing black men having intercourse with white women, and for some reason these white supremacists both like get enjoyment but also anger out of it. It's this weird mix that white supremacists have. So the just being able to attack a black man, even if it's just digitally, just online, gives these white supremacists this almost sexual satisfaction. It's very disturbing, but also, you know, I can relate this back to Sathnam Sanghera's book, Empireworld, where he talks about how slave owners would do something called buck breaking, where they would forcefully penetrate black men to, you know, try and make them feel like they are lesser than, you know. And he does make reference to epigenetically, maybe this is why certain communities do have homophobic beliefs, but then he also does then say there's not really much proof for that, but there is, you know, people saying that. But even this forced attack on black men's sexuality is because white supremacists want to position themselves above black men. And so even though they couldn't do that physically in regards to Jason Arday, they were doing it digitally. They were trying to force their power, force their position onto Jason Arday by continuously attacking him, by putting him in his place, is how many of these people framed it. You know, they said he was trying to be someone who he actually wasn't. He was trying to be in a place where he didn't deserve to be. Nathan Confast, like I said, doesn't think black people should be academics. He doesn't think they have the means to be so. And so all of this is due to the inherent white supremacy, not just in Britain here, but across the Western Hemisphere, or across the global north, or, you know, former colonial nations. All of this is rooted in white supremacy. Obviously, like I said at the beginning, none of these books are specifically about white supremacy. That's just because I haven't read any books on white supremacy that are deep enough that I'm confident to speak about them like I have about these 3 books. Obviously, there are papers I have read, there are articles I have read, there's all of these other stuff that I have read, but, you know, I don't talk about those here. But, you know, if you have any suggestions of those, you can comment them down below. Some other books I would recommend, I just don't have as deep a knowledge, even though I have read them. I just haven't gone back and reread them like these books that I have. I would suggest Black Climate, Confronting Counterinsurgency, Natives by Akala, Culture and Imperialism. I would say Women, Race and Class by Angela Davies, obviously much of the books that are on the Black Panthers reading list. All of these things are talking about the link between white supremacy and, you know, the attacks on, in this case in particular, black people, on black men. You know, I'm gonna get I know how I'm gonna title this video. I'm gonna get people in my comments who aren't even gonna get to this part of the video, who are gonna be like, ugh, leave then, get out of here, don't be here. You know, yeah, actually we are better than you, we are supreme. You know, YouTube doesn't care about those kind of comments. I report them and they say there's no issue with them. You know, even the frameworks of the corporations that we underrate upper are white supremacist in nature. But all of these readings, they will help you, they'll educate you. Even the books I've just mentioned there, they will educate you. But at the end of the day, this isn't going to change unless we make it change. You know, there will be those of us who are going to do it through the law. There are those of us who are going to do it through educating. There are those of us who are going to do it through direct action. There are going to be many different routes one can take. And again, I know how I'm going to title this, and I know people are going to misunderstand what I title it as, but I'm not saying all white people are white supremacists. There are many that are white supremacists. There are many that have white supremacist ideology, but they don't realize it. White supremacy thought processes is a better way of saying it. There are those of them who are happy to function under white supremacy, even though they don't believe in white supremacy. But there are going to be those that don't believe, that, you know, don't support white supremacy. Those who will be allies and things. And that's kind of the case with this in general. But if you can find a way to do something, obviously I'm going to put the Jason R. Day GoFundMe in the description down below, but I'm also going to say to you, like anything where I talk about activism, try and meet it where you can. You know, if you can get involved with organizations volunteering, if you can do raising awareness stuff, even something like talking to your family members who you feel might have some white supremacist tendencies, or at least have that ingrained white supremacy that has been taught to them through the Western education system. If you talk to them, that is better than doing nothing, so to speak. So yeah, a bit more serious, a bit of a last minute video. I didn't really have the time to do the research I really wanted to on this video. Maybe I'll revisit it with a more well-read version of this video. But yeah, I'm not going to do my usual call out at the end of the video, because it just feels a bit to do that right now. But yeah, that's the video. Bye.